Hey everyone, so I'm in the middle of making another video for the channel, and so I'd figure I'd give kind of a Quickflicks audio update, sort of quickie sort of thing. I was going to do Black Widow last week, but unfortunately I was busy with some other stuff. I was trying to find a job, I was trying to find some other things to do, and I did not get around to doing it. So we're going to cover Black Widow, we're also going to cover Jungle Cruise and Old in this video, and currently I'm in the process of making a video for next week that's going to cover a familiar topic if you know my channel, about Back to the Future, and this week we also have Suicide Squad, so that's going to be a review this week. So let's get started with Black Widow. So Black Widow is the 24th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's directed by Kate Shortland, and this follows the titular character of Black Widow, once again reprised by Scarlett Johansson. This is a film that attempts to rectify the misgivings of the past by giving an origin-ish story to Natasha Romanoff, and to tell a story that is very heartwarming and relatable and attempts to make her death in Endgame justified. I've already given some of my thoughts about this film on the All That Film podcast, which I will link in the description below, but for the most part, I felt that this movie was better than I expected. Certainly, it's not going to be in anyone's top-tier film list of all time, but it definitely serves the purpose of telling the story of Black Widow. Should it have been better? Yes. Should it have been done way before now? Probably. And I will also say this, that because of when this film is positioned in the Marvel Cinematic Universe timeline, it probably should have been released before the events of Infinity War and Endgame, because it would have had a much more deeper impact socially, but we can thank, Ike Perlmutter for that bullshit. But in any case, I felt Black Widow is a really fun and sometimes dumb movie. I mean, you got to expect it at this point that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is never really going to do top tier, like, this is cinema type movie. They're just made for entertainment, and I feel like a lot of people either undervalue or overvalue the MCU. And Black Widow is no exception, because Black Widow is just a fun, if not sometimes complicated and flawed movie, but it definitely has its peak action sequences. It has some humor here and there, but there's some truly dark stuff that's in this film that I wasn't expecting. I also feel in some way that, yes, this movie covers a lot of things such as, agency, woman's agency in the age of man, various other things, but I also feel like this should have been written by women. And no offense to men who want to write good female characters, but I feel like a story like this that has to do with female agency because of the Red Room and what this story is ultimately leading to, it should have been written by a woman. Sure, it's directed by a woman, and there's some things that were improv, like with Florence Pugh's whole thing with the forced hysterectomy stuff. It basically was essentially a film that should have been written by a woman. Now, I will say this, I am kind of a decent fan of the Taskmaster reveal, mostly because it fits well into the story. Does it work as an adaptation of the character? No, it definitely doesn't. But if I know one thing about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is that they'll technically use names and character positions in the MCU from other, things and just, retrofit them to match their story, such as the Mandarin being used as sort of like a xenophobic linchpin for a weapons company, AIM, so that AIM can try to outmaneuver Stark in Iron Man 3. But if I know anything about the MCU, is that they'll do that, and then they'll say, but there is an actual Mandarin in the MCU, which is what we're getting with Shang-Chi next month, I believe. And at this point, it shouldn't surprise anyone that maybe Taskmaster will return at some point. Either someone picked up the device that had the Taskmaster program, or, maybe we develop a little bit more upon the Taskmaster that we already have in this show. Now, I will say also that it is going to be a little bit weird if you ever try to watch this in chronological order, because technically you can't really see the end credit scene. So, spoilers if you haven't seen it. I don't know how you haven't yet. Basically, what happens in the end credit scene is that Yelena is visiting the grave of Natasha Romanoff, And what happens is, like, she visits the grave of Natasha Romanoff. And when you're watching it in chronological order, and if someone hasn't seen, like, the movies before, they'll be like, what? Natasha's dead? And so basically, you might want to skip that until, like, after Endgame. Or unless you have really good editing skills, you'll probably just edit together all the movies in chronological order just to save face. But, that's another thing. On top of that, where there is some good acting as well, I think Florence Pugh does a pretty decent job as Yelena. She's pretty good. She has some comedic chops while also being her own character, and a decent calling card for what she's going to do next in a Hawkeye TV show. I also really enjoyed David Harbour's Red Guardian, and I hope that we get a little bit more of him in the future. I would not mind if he actually fought Sam Wilson, Captain America, that we previously established. Not entirely sure what we're going to go with that, where we're going to go with that. The third act definitely is a lot of people's lowest point, and I kind of tend to agree. It's very over the top. It's very silly. It's very dumb for something that was largely grounded for the most part. But if you really consider that early on in the movie she was watching Moonraker, which basically had a reference to the fact that the villain's base is on the moon, and similarly into this movie, like, the base is in the clouds, it doesn't really bother me that much. So in total, I think Black Widow is a fine movie. It should have been done years ago, but because of stupid studio management, it never got made because, Ike Perlmutter was a fucking asshole. And, it was fine. I really enjoyed it. It definitely exceeded some of my expectations for the film, even if my expectations weren't necessarily high. So I'm going to give Black Widow a B-. So next up, let's talk about Old. I did not like Old at all. I think Old is where I kind of stopped really supporting Shyamalan. Shyamalan is a director that I have kind of a love-hate relationship with. Sometimes his movies can be really fun and entertaining and maybe insightful. I mean, a lot of people really like The Sixth Sense. That's my position. I liked Unbreakable. I kind of like Split, even though there's some issues with the representation of mental illness being framed as a villain character. But as far as the rest of the filmography goes, they could be either, hit or miss. There's definitely a lot of misses, like The Happening, After Earth, various other films. Oh yeah, Avatar: The Last Airbender. But as far as Old goes, it's an adaptation of a comic graphic novel by the name of Sandcastles. And as far as I have done in terms of research, it's fairly accurate to the book, but there's some things that were probably best left unanswered. Because for the majority of this movie, it feels like a Twilight Zone episode, and it could have been handled like a Twilight Zone episode. But unfortunately, this film goes way out of its way to explain every little detail, and it makes me mad. This is the one film of M. Night's whole career that I have just almost slept through. I've almost slept through this movie because this film is so expository and it's so boring. Now, are there things that are actually good about the movie? Well, yeah, there is some acting bits that aren't so bad. I think the cinematography, for the most part, looks crisp. The beach location is pretty cool, I guess. And there's some visual effects stuff that they've done in this film that is kind of interesting. There's this whole thing with, like, a tumor, like, extraction that's, like, kind of, like, wince-inducing. Like, that is kind of, like, some cool visual storytelling. There is some nice shots here and there that actually have a visual storytelling motif, but my other main problem with this movie is that it really wants to hold your hand throughout every little bit of this movie, whereas the book it is based off of is a book that doesn't hold your hand, like, at all. It's a book that has a little bit of intrigue here and there, but you're kind of left to your own devices in terms of what this story means. And the story is a very big allegory for aging, and of course, that whole part of it is going to be hammered to death in a Shyamalan film. But another thing, too, that I've come to hate a little bit more about Shyamalan's films as of late is that he loves to position people with mental illness as a villain. And so we have a character in this film that develops schizophrenia. which at first I thought it was dementia, but it wasn't. It wasn't until like later on during the twist sequence that it was confirmed it was schizophrenia, and they really positioned him in a form of a villain role that I just don't like. I really don't. He has a real issue when it comes to discussing mental illness in any like way. And as far as I know, like I think this was a change from the book to the movie. Not entirely sure if that's the case, but to be honest with you guys, I did not like Old. Old is not great. It has some things that go for it, but in terms of everything else, from the way the story is told, to some really bad editing choices, to that really lame ass twist, I just did not enjoy this. I understand Old is going to have its fans because some people are very diehard Shyamalan fans. And to be honest here, I just was not a fan. If Shyamalan actually took the time to understand this movie and to tell the story in a way that isn't meant to be hand-holdy and was more of an A24 type film, then that would have been very interesting. But unfortunately, this movie just isn't so good. And so I'm going to give Old a D+. So let's talk about Jungle Cruise. So Jungle Cruise comes from this long line of theme park attraction movies. And I've talked about them before on this channel. I've talked about Twilight Zone, Tower of Terror. I've talked about the Pirates movies. And so now we have Jungle Cruise that very much feels like Romancing the Stone meets Pirates of the Caribbean meets African Queen. And it just is a great amalgamation of all those. Plus you have a little bit of Indiana Jones in there to like really spruce it up. It takes place during World War I and follows Emily Blunt's character, who wants to find the petals of the moon. And this petal, according to legend, can cure any curse and cure any disease or injury. Basically, it's like a revive potion, essentially. And so what ends up happening is she goes down to the Amazon and meets The Rock as the skipper, who is going to take her through the Amazon. And while that is happening, they're being pursued by this German guy who wants the petals to win the First World War. And that's basically it. This movie is very much a fun, entertaining movie. It does have its problems, but for the most part, I found myself really enjoying some of the jokes, even a lot of the dad jokes that the ride is known for, with all the, with all the things like the backside of water, all the bad dad puns. I ended up really enjoying this film from start to finish. There are some things that are a little questionable in this film, and some people have rightfully pointed it out, such as the fact that the gay character kind of does feel like it's written from the 30s, but then at the same time you also have to understand this is set in 1916. So certain phrases would not be familiar during that time. So when he says he has allegiances elsewhere, or I have like an attraction elsewhere, yeah, that kind of like beats around the bush that he's gay in the film, but like at least his character actually has a character. Like he goes through kind of an arc, but I'm not entirely sure if it fully works. This is a character that has a lot of, complications, and to me personally, I think it works kind of well. There's some dumb things, of course, that they do with the character that isn't so great. It does fall into some of the usual stereotypes, but at least it's not terrible. And he does have an arc, he does play a role in the story, and he's pretty proactive in certain scenes that, actually make him a character for the most part. And this is kind of a step above some of the other stupid shit that Disney has done, where it's like, oh yeah, this one character that we can cut from the scene easily is our first gay character. Oh, LeFou is our first gay character. Disney at this point doesn't know exactly which character is their first, and I think this particular character, the brother character to Emily Blunt's doctor character, is kind of the closest we'll get. I want there to be better representation, but as far as representation goes, this is kind of a start, I guess. There just needs to be more input from the LGBT community when it comes to movies that want to introduce, LGBT characters. But as far as the rest of the movie goes, it's entertaining. The action scenes were kind of fun, although I will say, with some of the visual effects, it makes it like kind of. Some of the visual effects are just. It just makes some of the action scenes kind of like blurry or blendy. Some of it, anyway. That's just my own personal opinion on that. But as far as the action goes, it really, again, it does remind me of Pirates of the Caribbean. The plot kind of reminds me of, like, African Queen and Romancing the Stone. It reminds me of those films. And for the most part, they do a pretty bang-up good job in terms of making an original movie out of a ride. And this is the first time in a long time that I've said that, because Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl was, like, the biggest, like, theme park attraction movie ever. Like, before that point, there was Mission to Mars, there was The Country Bears, there was the Tower of Terror Disney Channel movie. Those were not great movies. And for Pirates of the Caribbean to come out, it was a very influential film, and they made 5 of those films. And then they made, like, Tomorrowland, which is kind of, like, split between reception. Personally, I've enjoyed it. There's some things that don't work, but I've enjoyed it. And as far as Jungle Cruise goes, this is the closest we can get to matching, in my view, the success of the first Pirates of the Caribbean film, creating an original film that is set within the theme park world. So I'm very interested to see if they can keep this energy up for the Haunted Mansion adaptation they have going right now, or if it's not going to be that great. So I'm going to give the Jungle Cruise movie a B+. And last but not least, I want to talk about The Green Knight. The Green Knight is a brand new A24 distributed film and is directed by David Lowery, who did A Ghost Story, and tells the tale of the nephew of King Arthur, who has to go on a quest 1 year after a Christmas party to be dealt a blow by the Green Knight. And this movie is definitely not what it seems. Now, a lot of the marketing, I have a huge problem with the marketing of this film, because the marketing makes people believe that this is going to be a huge, like, action-adventure fantasy film that's, like, akin to Dungeons & Dragons. Hell, even A24 made a Dungeons & Dragons type, like, board game on their website that people can buy. But mostly, The Green Knight is much more of a metaphor and a meditation on the virtues of honor and what value they have in the face of death. And it is something that a lot of people don't like. If you take a look at the Rotten Tomatoes audience score, it's pretty much like split in half. Half of the people did not like this movie, mostly because, I'll admit it, it's a little bit pretentious at times. But it definitely isn't as pretentious as A Ghost Story, because, like, I enjoyed A Ghost Story, but I did feel it was a very pretentious film when you have one character that basically explains the plot of the movie partway through. But this film just takes it in a different direction. There's a lot of walking, there's a lot of background detail, and this quest that this guy has to go on for a full week, you watch that progression, and you see a lot of visuals, visual metaphors, and a lot of interesting color choices that point to inner character struggles. It's stuff like that, and it's a film that requires people to, like, think, right? And I think for a lot of people, they were expecting a fantasy adventure film akin to, like, I don't know, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, or Lord of the Rings, but this film has its, like, dark fantasy elements. It's just, it wants to take its time in telling the story of this character. And this is an adaptation of an old Arthurian tale that not a lot of people really read. I read a little bit of King Arthur in high school, and I don't think we ever covered this one. But it was interesting to watch. This film is shot immaculately. It looks so beautiful. It looks so crisp. Even the visual effects don't look half bad in this movie, and it looks pretty good. I think the color palette is just so beautiful to look at. The costume designs are like peak performance. Costume designs, set designs, everything works about it. There is some weird choices in this film. There's one where, someone gets a hand job and it's just kind of weird. But by the end of the movie, it pulls together a lot of the stringent ideas that the film scattered about throughout the entire movie. And I think it works. Also, the creature design for the Green Knight is also very fucking good. I love the creature design. I love the character design. I just love everything about this character. It looks really good. But is it pretentious? Yeah, it could be a little bit pretentious at times, and definitely isn't accessible to general audiences. It's much more accessible to people who can understand movies and visual metaphor and all this other stuff. So, yeah, I think The Green Knight is definitely worth your time if you're very much interested in, some fantasy elements with some deep storytelling, or at least visual storytelling that tells a pretty decent story. Again, it isn't for everyone. A lot of David Lowery's films are not made for everyone. They're very much, meditations on death and honor, and it's a lot of stuff. So, yeah, I'm going to give The Green Knight a B. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to my little chat about these movies. Hopefully next week I will have a new video out, and I should also be getting my review of the Suicide Squad sometime up this weekend. If not, then it would be after my video on a certain comic. So, yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.